I find when people are talking about AI, there's a lot of imprecision, and very often one half of the conversation will be talking about the model, and the other half of the conversation will be talking about the system in which the model is being sort of nested for implementation. And so it's really important to sort of separate these steps and these inputs and stages. And by understanding this, we can sort of understand where some of the mischief arises and also where the opportunities arise. So the model is really a byproduct of technology running on masses of data, right? And everybody in this room is I think, very focused on that data slice in this particular map. And that is an enormous representation of this slide. So I hope you can read it. If not, I'm happy to share it after. The part that I really want to focus on, though, that gets missed a lot in the technical conversations, but will come up in every single conversation that you have around oversight and governance, which is where we spend our time, is that human sort of wrapper, right, on this whole system. And that's important not just because humans should be in the loop, which is what we hear a lot, and also a sort of imprecise concept, but because humans are essential at every step of the AI system's application. From selecting the business use case, which is really where a lot of the European regulation is focused, is on the use cases. It's not so much regulating AI as it is how we're using it and in what context. How we're framing the actual objectives for the model, which in the sort of classic AI, if we're calling it, I think, classic or OG AI, as opposed to generative AI, setting the objectives was a very sort of proprietary and behind the screen activity. With generative AI, that now sits in the hands of every single human on the planet who has access to one of these GPT tools. And that's on the sort of the input side. On the back end of the process, though, what the models produce are outputs, and those are statistical probabilities and predictions. It's a massive prediction engine fundamentally, but most of these models in production are doing right now. But what we do with those outputs and how much distance we put between a model output and a commercial outcome, for instance, is very much a human function and a function of the human system that's been installed around the model. And for some kinds of applications, like recommending, I'm looking at these guys' shoes, they're all fabulous. So in recommending the next shoes they want to buy, the distance between the model's output and the recommender engine and what the outcome is, which is serving up a fabulous pair of pumps, can be very tightly coupled. There doesn't have to be a lot of distance. But when we start talking about underwriting, financial products or insurance products or determining healthcare outcomes, that distance between outputs and outcomes becomes much more significant, and is very much a deliberate decision by management and oversight. And so when we start talking about technology governance, whether it's in the context of a business or a department or a family or a government, we're looking at that whole system and how humans sort of impact at each of these steps. And we can talk about this sort of more as we go on through the presentation. So why don't we go on? So model outputs, apple pie. Pretty straightforward. What's interesting about these generative AI tools in particular is that because they're just predicting the next most sort of statistically relevant output, you'll get a range of, you can ask the same question multiple times and get a range of outputs. So I said, show me an apple pie. And more often than not, you get something that looks like something up in this corner that looks like something you'd want to eat. Every now and then, though, you get this kind of crazy output, which is the pie sign made out of apples. Right? That happens. And we can call it a hallucination, we can call it an error, we can call it actually intentional. So if I'm looking for goofy slides to put in a presentation, that actually is that's an output I wanted and I liked, but that's very contextual. So these errors that can come up are very much a product not just of sort of what the data contain or how the technology is running or the algorithms are running on that or with that data, but it's very much a question of how humans ask the question, right? So am I looking for an apple pie that would be fit for my grandmother to eat, or am I looking for an apple pie that I want to put into a goofy presentation? And you'll get everything in between. From a governance perspective, I'll just put a pin in this in a second. If you're getting very expected outcomes or very unexpected outcomes, that's when you really need to pay the most attention because you're missing everything in between, right? And it's also why when we give guidance around how to actually work with these tools, we really encourage asking the same question multiple times, asking the same question multiple ways. So you start to get a sense of what is the range of outcomes that this particular model you're working with can produce, and then you can sort of start to tune it and decide really where you want it to go. Bias, so we've got errors, we've got bias. I think bias is both inherent and a species of error, depending on how you're thinking about your model. When you go to OpenAI right now and ask for a picture of a flight attendant, you get that. We all know that that's not the sum total or range of flight attendants or good flight attendants, and that's problematic. And that's because, again, the models are really looking at statistical probabilities more than they are any underlying source of truth. And so we've just got to be, and I'm giving you some basic examples so you can start to see where when we give these tools more complicated tasks, these same sort of basic functions and characteristics are running in the background.
I'm insulted by the lawyers.
And the lawyers, it's a little, well, I mean, the one with the neck thing is sort of appropriate for today.
Head.
Well, the one without a head is probably, I can't speak any on that. And then the other thing I want to focus on before we get more into it is that the language we're using around artificial intelligence, including the term artificial intelligence, is really problematic. And whenever I'm speaking to lawyers or the media or both, I'm begging, really, that we start to get a lot more precise with the language that we use. We tend to default to things like anthropomorphizing these models. They're not really hallucinating. They're not really reasoning. They're just calculating. They're just creating statistical probabilities, and we've got to sort of clean up our language, which is not easy because whether you're talking about English or any other language that we've been using, they're not agreed terms. We're using the same terms to mean different things, different terms to mean the same thing, and they're all fairly imprecise. We tend to set up false choices, that you can have privacy or transparency, but everybody in this room knows that it's a much more nuanced exercise than that, and so when we speak about it, we have to be careful. When we're talking about synthetic images, I was talking to some of you last night, there was that image of the explosion at the Pentagon that ran around and sort of briefly destabilized the US stock market. But every single media account of that episode talked about the fake image of the explosion at the Pentagon. And when we unpacked that, what the really critical thing was that it was a very real image of a fake explosion at a building that wasn't the Pentagon, right? And so it's up to those of us who are characterizing these outputs before they become outcomes to be really, really careful about what it is we're handling. People have real reactions to these images, and they should. And then the last thing I would say is that, and they're intended to, by the way, when we talk, I know there's a gaming session later, and what AI is doing in the art field is both controversial and magical. I mean, it's a really remarkable moment. But I want to focus also on labeling and annotations because this is a data crowd. And one of the things that we're finding is that outside of rooms like this, and the people that you work with, there's very little understanding for how underlying data is assigned the significance and meaning that it has. And that ends up driving these model outputs in very significant ways, as much as how the question gets asked. So finding all the red apples or remove all the green apples, two very different questions, right? But even when we get to describing, and this is like a little workshop we do that I'm grossly abbreviating for you guys, describing the simplest objects can be a complicated and actually sort of fun exercise. But unless we understand what the underlying intention and motivation is of how data are labeled, when we get to things like flight attendant, we get the same, we might not get lawyers without heads very often, but we are going to get a white male Western looking guy, right? When we look for lawyers, because somebody has labeled that lawyer, or somebody has labeled flight attendant or teacher. And it's fun to play this game with apples because you can, particularly when you get into the significance of apples as opposed to the physical characteristics of them. Culturally, there are huge varieties, and we've sort of captured some of these here, that the actual symbolic meaning of these objects can vary widely. And so some of the mischief that we see, some of the hallucination we get, or whatever we want to call it, is really a byproduct of these underlying labeling characteristics.
Yeah, so I guess where are we going is the question. You've got people like Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI, who left Google, not because he was 75, because he was worried about where AI was going. You've got people like Elon Musk and a whole pile of people telling the governments we need to pause. Do we? I mean, it seems to, I was looking at the agenda and I think we've got AI in every other session this year. Yeah. We're certainly seeing it come over our desks at speed. Is it accelerating to a point of being scary, or do you think we're okay?
I mean, I think there's a reason everybody's anxious about it. So the one thing I would say is that I'm going to park my views about Hinton and Musk, but I live in the Bay Area, so I might have a few. But I think the significant thing is that the people who are closest to these models are asking for them to be governed, and they're asking for all of us to participate in that governance. There's not consensus around what that means, but I think there's an acknowledgement that if we leave these tools to do what the tools are going to do and just sort of treat them like an ordinary device, yes, they are going to they're going to trend in directions we don't want to go and we should be nervous about. I think if we get involved and everybody sort of figures out what they mean by technology governance, how they, request that their children be educated, how they involve their children in developing competencies around these sorts of things, what kind of, as consumers, what we accept and what we don't accept, we have a shot at managing what could otherwise be a frightening event. I will say that this is never going to be less complicated or move more slowly, right? That we are now hitting this exponential curve, and it's going to feel like this for a while, right? So we've all got to figure out how we want to be and how we want to govern in a world that is changing very quickly and is raising all of these fairly profound questions. And we'll get to some of the significance of that. But if we're just waiting for things to quiet down, I think that's a false hope.
I was trying to work out where on this scale is it Terminator? Where do the robots take over the Earth?
Yeah, well, so here's the thing. Well before the robots take over the Earth, disinformation is going to take over your inbox. and I worry more about that, right? Just in the very short term, because that's going to that's going to have not only mental health implications, but it's going to have productivity implications. And if you're managing a team that is inundated with disinformation and can't trust that Gail, when she says, I'll meet you in Cambridge at 10 a.m., that's really Gail, or 10 is really the time, where the Fiona will really be there, that's just a cognitive load on every one of us that we're going to encounter lots and lots of times a day. And so I worry more about that in the very short term. I think, again, unattended, we're not careening, but we're heading toward a superintelligence environment. We don't know what happens when these large language models link up. Really, we don't really know what happens when you're dealing with multiple agents who are 85% competent at most things. It's the insights that we want for our business aren't necessarily, they're not all going to be pleasant. And so we're going to have to, as humans, exercise control and judgment and rules around, and governance around what's appropriate in the settings that we're actually managing, right? So I think, as I am fond of saying, and everybody sort of groans, is that the questions, the ethical questions, the compliance questions, the governance questions, the management questions get a lot harder as the technologies get better. Like right now we've been focused on sort of the deficits of these tools and where they don't work and where they kind of screw up. The more interesting questions are when they're not screwing up. They're actually producing quite adequate responses, but those adequate responses are illegal, uncomfortable, at odds with other, objectives, or just the impact of those recommendations and outputs aren't in step with sort of the context of the business we're trying to run or the government we're trying to administer.